Good morning, friends, and welcome back to Infinite Gems, where we discover the gems upon the shelves that help us discover the gems within ourselves. February is Black History Month, and I wanted to share a couple of books that I think do a really great job of celebrating the talent and brilliance and courage of people who have brought a sense of possibility and wonder and beauty and joy into our lives. The first book that I wanted to share with you is A Ride to Remember, a civil rights story by Sharon Langley and Amy Nathan. The story starts with Sharon Langley and how she lived near this amusement park but was never allowed to go because of rules of segregation. You can see these beautiful illustrations where she's sitting on a tree and looking out at the carousel. It continues and describes some of the protests that would happen, how protesters on this 4th of July held their signs out and sang freedom songs. We have another little story in the story of the carousel that describes how kids really helped with the situation too. So here we see that 11-year-old Lydia Finney and her aunt Mabel Grant go on a secret protest at the park. They both had light-colored skin. He thought the park's ticket taker might not know they were black. So this black family ended up going into the park, and no one really realized that. A reporter reported it, and that was the beginning of this particular carousel getting a lot more national attention. Eventually, the park was desegregated, and Sharon was the first black child to be able to ride the carousel. And now the carousel is not in Baltimore, but in DC. So if there's anyone who lives in this area, has kids, don't have kids, maybe you can go on a date, go check out the carousel and take your time to just honor and remember that history of how it came to be that all of us can ride that carousel together today. Journalists and reporters have played a huge role in creating social transformation, both at the local, the national, and international level. And that is why the next book that I wanted to highlight is The Power of Her Pen, the story of groundbreaking journalist Ethel L. Payne by Lessa Klein Ransom and John Pata. The story starts off in 1911, the year Ethel was born, and also describes her home life and her schooling, and how each day the neighborhood residents screamed and yelled and threw rocks at a black girl who dared to go to school with whites. It was a difficult time, for sure, but because she was so talented, one of the things that ended up happening at her school is that she was the first black student to be able to write for the school paper. She ended up having an opportunity to travel abroad. She went to Japan, and while she was there, she ended up writing stories about how black soldiers were treated differently than white soldiers. Her stories eventually ended up getting a lot of attention in the United States, and because of that, she got a job offer to work at the Chicago Defender. Because of her work at the Chicago Defender, she ended up writing and bringing a lot of attention to issues related to jobs and the civil rights movement, housing, healthcare, and a lot of other community events. And eventually that led her to go to the White House and start interviewing presidents and question them about issues related to laws, legislation, education. And she became known as the First Lady of the Black Press because she spent so much time in the White House. The next book that I'd like to share with you, I absolutely adore. It's The Secret Garden of George Washington Carver, illustrated by Frank Morrison, written by Jean Beretta. I first heard about George Washington Carver when I was in the 3rd grade, and of course it was highlighting how he had discovered the peanut and the many uses. But this book brings out the spirit of his magic and his generosity and just his devotion to the plant world, and how he wants to use everything that he's learned from that natural world to create a better world for all of us. It starts off with him as a child in Diamond Grove, Missouri in 1874, and how he had this secret garden that no one knew about, where he would care for his flowers and how much he loved them. The black Susans winked when he patted the soil around their roots, and he sang to the dandelions, and they waved to him with their long leaves. At one point he describes how, because he isn't able to go to school, he decides to create his own classroom in the woods and studied the subject he loved most, nature. It also describes how, because he was around nature and who he was growing up with, he learned to be very resourceful and creative. So on this page, for example, we see how turkey feathers were used to make sewing needles, and dyes were made from nuts and berries, and plants and leaves for medicine. The book describes how eventually he studied agriculture and taught agriculture and was given the opportunity to work in his own lab, and he experimented there with new crops to replace cotton like sweet potatoes and soybeans. But of course, as we know, the peanut was his his big champion, and he discovered about 300 uses for them. But what I really love about his story is it also describes how he shared his knowledge with people. Carver created a traveling schoolhouse called the Jessup Agricultural Wagon to visit poor farmers. It offered everything from tool demonstrations to medical care to pamphlets on how to improve farms and live healthier. In its first summer, the wagon visited over 6,000 people. And what I love about this story is it really captures the essence of his spirit and his reverence for people and his reverence for nature. And I wanted to just share the last page with you. Regard nature, revere nature, respect nature. Yeah, I found this book really inspiring, and it actually reminded me of a dream that I had once had a while ago about maybe creating an interfaith trail in Rock Creek Park, which is a park in DC, because I really believe that nature and a walk in the woods, as he describes, can be healing, and nature can really be our best teacher, and we have so much to learn, and I want to be able to create more opportunities for people to connect with nature in that way. It is close to Valentine's Day, so I thought I'd share a couple of favorite stories of mine that really highlight not only the spirit of love, but the real history of St. Valentine. So the first book that I'd like to share with you is St. Valentine, retold and illustrated by Robert Sabuda. Really cool illustrations done in a mosaic style. He was a physician, and many people from around the town would come to visit him and ask him for healing. And one day, a jailer who works in the local prison comes by and brings his daughter, who is born blind, and he asks Valentine for healing. And Valentine responds and says, yes, I would like to help her, but this will take time. And every week, the family comes back, the father and the daughter. One day, Valentine hears a knock at the door, and it's not the father and the daughter. It's actually people who are trying to arrest him because they believe that he is practicing a faith that the leadership does not practice. At the jail, encounters the jailer who had brought his blind daughter to him. And Valentine slowly nods, asks for a pen and ink and something to write on. And when he came back, the priest quickly wrote on the scrap of papyrus and handed it back to the jailer. And when the jailer returns home that day, he's greeted by his daughter. He slid the scrap of papyrus out of his waist belt, unrolled it, and handed it to the child. What does it say, Father? Asked the child as a yellow crocus fell from the small scroll into her hand. From your Valentine, her father read. Slowly the child held up the blossom before her face, and for the first time watched its color dazzle like the rays of the afternoon sun. So one of the reasons I really like this book is it reminds me that, there's all forms of love. I think often on St. Valentine's Day, we think of romantic love, which is wonderful, but that there are various forms of love that are gorgeous and beautiful and healing in all kinds of ways. So in that same spirit of spreading love and understanding that it's a healing balm, I wanted to share this really adorable story called Somebody Loves You, Mr. Hatch, by Eileen Spinelli and pictures by Paul Yalowitz. It is the story of a man named Mr. Hatch who did not smile very much, and he didn't talk to anyone at work, and he lived kind of a bit of a lonely life, and people would say, oh, well, he just keeps to himself. But then one day, a box is delivered to his door, and then it has a little white card that says, somebody loves you. And Mr. Hatch is just totally confused. He's like, who? Somebody loves you, he whispers to himself. I've got a secret admirer. And he doesn't know who it is. It doesn't even really matter. And he is glowing. He starts dancing in the street. He's waving to everybody. His heart has been touched. And he goes to work and he shares his candy with everybody. And he spreads the love that he feels in his heart. He helps his neighbors out. He makes some of the kids brownies and just fills the air with love. But then one day, the postman comes back and says, actually, Mr. Hatch, that box of chocolates was for somebody else. And Mr. Hatch's heart just breaks. And he says to himself, well, nobody loved me after all. And the next day, he leaves his house, has a meal by himself at work, and feels very, very lonely. And all the neighbors are around and says, well, what's wrong with Mr. Hatch? The postman explains to them what happens, and they say, well, but we love Mr. Hatch, and they remember all the things that he has done to help them out as neighbors. And they come up with an idea, and they decide the next day they would fill his home with love. It's a really sweet story, and I just love the way that it shows us different ways of expressing love and kindness to our neighbors and people who might feel lonely during this time. So if you're out there and you know a Mr. Hatch in your life, please go ahead and express some love for him. Another really sweet book that I recently discovered is Love Is by Diane Adams, illustrated by Claire Keene. It's about a little girl who discovers a duckling and just develops this really sweet relationship. It talks about love in a way that also describes some of the challenges that come along. So love is noisy midnight feedings, shoebox right beside the bed. It's peaceful sleeping, no more peeping, tucked in tightly head to toes. Love is waking up together side by side and beak to nose. So as you can see, it rhymes, so that makes it really fun, and it just describes how sometimes it's not easy to take care of someone. It can be early mornings or messy bath times, tidying up when you don't want to. But I think it's a really great way for kids to learn about responsibility and the different ways that we show love and care for something or someone. The last book that I wanted to share with you is The Heart of a Whale by Ana Pigdataro. It's a dreamily illustrated book that features a lovely little whale who loves to sing, and through his song, sings of happiness and hope, magic and wonder, always and everywhere, cheering up the octopus and singing lullabies to the new seahorses. This whale really brings a lot of joy and love into the sea. But sometimes there's also moments of quiet, and he thinks about how there was no song big enough to fill his empty heart, and the whale sighs. But that sigh is carried all the way across the ocean until it reaches another. And because there's a listening in the quiet that happens, this other travels through the sea, and the two meet. And together they sang of happiness and hope, magic and wonder. What I like about this book is that it reminds me that sound is touch at a distance, and we don't always see how our voice or our song travels or touches others, but it does. I really do believe that sound can have a ripple effect, and we never know who's listening or what magic may unfold when we allow our song to be sung. So with that, I thought today, instead of ending with a song, we could end by just holding our hands to our hearts and listening for a song inside of ourselves or a song from somewhere else that might be coming and wanting to be heard. So I thought we could do this together. Just put your hands on your heart and we'll take a few breaths and see if we hear anything inside. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a month that's full of love.